Hello everyone, my name is Maria Levy-Minzy and I am a assistant research scientist at the Center for Applied Research on Substance Use and Health Disparities here at Nova Southeastern University. I've spent the past 12 years doing research on substance use and drug use habits among different populations, different age ranges, and I'm also a marriage and family therapist, so I do have knowledge related to systemic approaches and so forth. But today I'm really going to be focusing on substance misuse in early adulthood. So today I'm really going to cover some basic material, why people use drugs, the dangers of drug and alcohol use in adolescence and emerging adulthood, current trends that we're seeing now in the national survey data, what addiction is, and some information about addiction treatment. So why do people use drugs? People use drugs for a lot of reasons. Most basically, people use drugs to feel good and not feel bad. Sometimes drugs help people perform better at work or school. I've had a lot of people that I've worked with that had an opiate use disorder, for example, and they described taking prescription opiates and how in the beginning the prescription opiates helped them to do their job better. They found themselves to be more focused, more social. And it also helps, or people use drugs typically because they're curious and they want to fit in. That's particularly for younger people. Most young people experience some level of social anxiety, and so oftentimes I've heard alcohol referred to as liquid courage. They would drink because it would make them feel more comfortable in social situations. And you may find the same thing for yourself, that you feel more comfortable in social situations, drinking, for example, just to kind of calm you down and make you feel more comfortable. So these are some of the basic reasons why people use drugs. People just kind of like to escape. So drugs basically excite the parts of your brain that make you feel good, and that's your dopamine receptors. And we'll talk more about this a little bit later. But after you take a drug for an extended period of time on a regular basis, the feel-good part of your brain gets used to taking the drug. So when that happens, you actually need more of the drug to get the same feeling, and your brain and body over time has to have the drug just to feel normal because it adapts. Your body adapts to the drug. So sometimes drug use starts as a way to escape, but it oftentimes can make your life much worse. Because then what ends up happening is you need the drug, and then when you take the drug away, you not only have the lousy feeling that you have from missing the drug, but then on top of having that lousy feeling, you also are stuck with feeling like you have all those additional problems in the first place that you were trying to hide from. So the dangers of drug use in adolescence and emerging adulthood. So what the research tells us is that the adolescent and emerging adult brain is still developing. And so there's a big emphasis on trying to deter young people from substance abuse because their brains are not developed yet. So as I mentioned, adolescence is a dramatic period of brain development. And brains are not fully developed until you're into your 20s even. And there's actually, the National Institute of Health has started an adolescent brain cognitive development study. And this particular study is going to be tracking drug use over time among young people. So they have a large cohort of people that they have gotten to enroll in the study. And they'll be tracking them over time so that we'll be able to get more data about actually what happens to the developing brain as it is exposed to drugs. Okay, but now I'm going to show you a little video clip about the development of the development in the brain and how it impacts.
As teens, people are always telling us we can't do. I stay up late? What could happen if I just play for 15 more minutes? Who cares if I smoke a joint every now and then? Let's face it, adults may mean well, but they can't really explain why they won't let us do this stuff. The thing is, there's actually a really cool explanation, and it has to do with our brains. From the outside, the brain of a newborn looks just like a smaller version of an adult brain, but there's a big difference. There's a ton of stuff that still needs to be programmed into a young person's brain. That's where our life experiences come in. How we interact with what's around us shapes our brains until we're in our mid-20s. We can't feel our brains changing, but they are super busy building circuits and programming. So how does this happen? Every little thing that happens to us can change our brain in huge ways. At short distances, our experiences can make or break connections between brain cells. By guiding the creation of circuits, experiences shape our perceptions, memories, and everything that makes us unique. But they also affect our brain across longer distances. This involves the construction of thick bundles of fibers that connect different brain regions. By creating this complex network, experiences help increase the brain's bandwidth, allowing it to work better and better. We've got to keep in mind, these short and long-range connections are influenced by everything we do and everything that happens to us. But this is awesome news. It means we are the programmers of our brains. Every decision, good or bad, influences how our brain develops. Let's talk about taking drugs. For example, pretend this is the keyboard you are using to program your brain. Using drugs just for fun or to get high would be like scrambling the letters on the keyboard. Now, if you scramble the letters on the keyboard after the program is written, that can lead to temporary errors or make it hard for the program to run for a while. But if you scramble the letters while the program is being written, the program can incorporate catastrophic, long-lasting glitches. This is why teens are better off without drugs. We are in the middle of coding our brains, and drugs can cause real problems that can last a long time. And yet, drugs are just one of the many possible ways of scrambling our keyboards. For example, not enough sleep, lack of exercise, or eating too much junk food can also harm our brain programs. So yeah, I get it. It's annoying to be told what we can and can't do, but I would rather focus on my ability to shape my brain through smarter decisions. It turns out we have far more control than we thought. We can use this information to choose our own paths and give ourselves the best possible futures.
So these videos are great. There's numerous, there's several of them that NIDA makes, and I suggest using them if you have students or client, like young clients, as an easier way just to kind of understand some of these dynamics. So this is why, okay, adolescence is a very important time. It's so important for us to make sure that people are not using drugs and engaging in these kinds of behaviors that can damage the developing brain, especially since we don't really know the extent of some of this damage, okay? So let me go back to where I was here. Okay. Sorry about that. Okay. So, what's going on now? What's the drug picture look like? So I'm going to give you some statistics now provided by the National Institute of Health from the Monitoring the Future study. So there's two different studies that they do. There's a Monitoring the Future study that focuses on 8th, 10th, and 12th graders. Okay, so this first set of results I'm going to provide you with is about teen drug use, 8th, 10th, and 12th grade among those folks. And then I'm going to talk about older, quote-unquote, young adults. So, I'm sure you may have seen some reports. The CDC is very concerned about vaping devices. So what you're seeing here is that nearly 2 in 5 students in 12th grade are vaping, which is very bad. But the worst part about it is that a lot of them are vaping marijuana, and that's the one that seems to be most damaging. The research shows, or has come out so far, that says that vaping marijuana People that vaped marijuana were more likely to have lung collapse as a result of vaping. Marijuana. So you can see here, these results go from 2008 through 2018. And marijuana use actually increased during this period, but then it kind of went down a little bit. But the trend graph here shows us the 10th grade marijuana use among 10th graders is increasing. It seems to be on the rise, that line. But it's basically steady, but there has been a decline for 8th graders, which is not a bad thing. But teens are more likely to use marijuana than cigarettes. And this has been a trend going on. Cigarette use has gone down tremendously, but you still have a lot of use of marijuana. Then you have vaping in terms of nicotine or marijuana across grades. And what you see here is that they're more likely to vape nicotine, okay, but they're still vaping marijuana as well. And I think that the very important aspect of this is that, young people are misusing marijuana. And even though marijuana is legal in many states, it doesn't make it safe in the same way that, alcohol is legal but not safe. I mean, it kills more people, complications from alcoholism. So it's really a very destructive drug, and marijuana is just as dangerous. And it has not been scientifically proven. If you look at the research out there, it has only been shown by research to be effective in assisting with seizure disorders. Other conditions, it can be prescribed for other conditions, but it actually, there aren't published studies related to its effectiveness for treatment of other disorders. And as I said, just because it's legal doesn't mean it's safe. So a lot of people are smoking it every day, and not only will it affect a developing brain, but it'll affect an older brain that is already developed, and then even older adult brains. There's been a real increase in marijuana use among older groups, people in their 40s, 50s, 60s, particularly since we've got the legalization of marijuana. And again, we don't really know how safe it is long term and chronically for this age range. Somebody who smokes pot like every day or a couple of times a week, as a swap out for wine, let's say, instead of having a glass of wine, they smoke marijuana. And we're not exactly sure what the long-term effects of that is. So in terms of binge drinking, there's actually been a decline in binge drinking across 8th, 10th, and 12th graders, which is a good thing. When you look at over-the-counter and prescription medications, so prescription drug misuse has been a very big problem over the past 15 years. It's an area that I've studied extensively. And what you see here is that 12th graders were misusing sedatives or tranquilizers first, and then medications like Adderall, which is prescribed for ADHD. A lot of young people tend to use Adderall, not prescribed to them, but they use it so that they're able to perform better at school. Ritalin also falls into that category. But when you look at illicit drugs, marijuana is the most commonly used drug. But students are reporting the lowest rates of prescription drug misuse since we started collecting data for this survey. But marijuana always seems to kind of hold steady as the number one. But if you look at Oxycontin versus Vicodin, for example, so Vicodin is a oxycodone drug, which is an opioid narcotic pain medicine. Vicodin contains oxycodone, which is the narcotic, and acetaminophen, which is Tylenol. So it's not pure oxycodone. It's not as strong. Oxycontin, on the other hand, is straight up oxycodone, which is a very potent narcotic opiate pain reliever. So Vicodins are typically easier to attain or get your hands on because most of the time Vicodins are prescribed for like minor surgery, dental surgery, things like that. So they'll be laying around in a medicine cabinet. Oxycontin is more regulated. It's harder to get a prescription for. But ever still, these numbers have gone down. So you're seeing less and less use of Vicodin and Oxycontin in the past 15 years, which is really good news. So now I want to shift gears and talk about young adults or college-age adults. These are people ages 19 to 22. Bear in mind, again, these folks do not have fully developed brains. So we're once again dealing with people that have undeveloped brains, and so these folks are more likely to have, negative effects associated with their drug abuse or drug misuse because of the fact that their brains are so malleable. So let's see what's going on among college age folks. So when we look at college folks in terms of marijuana use is at a historic high among 19 to 22 year olds. Okay, so it's particularly among college students. So there's been a 5-year increase for college students, a 7% increase over 5 years, which is a lot. Okay, then when we look at near daily use of marijuana, so people that are not enrolled in college but are in this age range of 19 to 22, they are nearly twice as likely to be using marijuana practically daily. Okay, so college students at a 5.9% of nearly daily marijuana use versus non-college students, which was 11%. So, people in college are using it pretty heavily, but then those that aren't enrolled in college and maybe are working and stuff like that, they're using it a lot more. So in terms of marijuana vaping has doubled among college students just from last year, which is pretty alarming given the fact that vaping marijuana has been found by the CDC to be detrimental and has been found to, cause lung failure in young people ages 18, 20 years old. So this is really very scary, actually, to see this. So when we look at nicotine vaping, again, nicotine vaping has also doubled among college students. It's also gone up among non-college students as well. 7.9 to 12.5% is considerable. Then in terms of prescription drug misuse among these young adults, it's a little bit mixed. So among college-aged, it's gone down. And it's also gone down among non-college age, which is really good because there has been, I think, a significant focus kind of in the media about the dangers of prescription drug misuse, and then there are all the overdose deaths associated with prescription opioid misuse. And then on top of that, you have all the additional laws that have been put in place to make it more difficult for doctors to prescribe, let's say, narcotic pain medications. So those kinds of things have made these drugs less available, and the less available they are, the less likely somebody is to try them. So people are not accessing them. They're not getting introduced to them, which is a good thing because they can be highly addictive. But Adderall misuse. So college and non-college folks are misusing Adderall. Again, Adderall is a drug that's used for ADHD. A lot of the studies show that young people and college students like to use Adderall when they don't have a ADHD. They're using it not prescribed. They use it because it's basically like for somebody who doesn't have ADHD, Adderall has a very significant impact on the body in terms of making it almost like everything speeds up. So you're laser focused, you have a lot of energy, you could sit and stay up for 18 hours straight and just write papers or, study for exams. You don't get hungry. The downside of it, of course, is then at the very end you crash at the end of this line. People tend to stay awake for 18 hours so they can study for their exams. Young people that aren't in college may be using it so that they can work an overnight shift or do better at work, perform better. But then what ends up happening is ultimately, you crash at the end of that cycle and you feel really lousy when you crash. And that can create a really very destructive cycle of using, continuing to use. So college males and females, there is a gender difference actually, where non-college females are using Adderall more often than non-college males, like double, which is kind of interesting. I'd be interested to know kind of like what are these non-college females doing? Do they work? Do they have families? What are they up to that they're also using Adderall? Binge drinking. So young adults with binge drinking, they tend to be the ones that everybody thinks about binge drinking in college. But so for the first time among college students, binge drinking is below 30%. Binge drinking is defined as 5 drinks in a row in the past 2 weeks. Okay. So now I want to take the opportunity to talk to you guys a little bit about addiction and what addiction is. So historically, addiction has been viewed as a moral failure. People who have an addiction have been looked at negatively by others. Oh, they don't have any willpower, they're weak, things like that. That was kind of the historic view of people who have substance use disorders. But that's actually not really true. So I want to try to help you guys understand a little bit about addiction. So the American Society on Addiction Medicine has always really looked at addiction as a primary chronic brain disease. So it's a disease of reward, motivation, memory, and circuitry. So basically the premise of this is that addiction is a disease and it causes dysfunction. Biological dysfunction, psychological dysfunction, social dysfunction. So there's many different levels of dysfunction that that addiction causes in the body. But typically addiction is characterized by a couple of different things, and these same things that I'm going to list now are basically part of the DSM-5 diagnosis of substance use disorder. But basically you're looking at an inability to abstain from the drugs, an inability to control yourself, increased cravings, you're experiencing significant consequences and problems in your social relationships, but you're not addressing those or ignoring them, and you're experiencing dysfunctional emotional responses. So with the idea that addiction is a chronic disease, then based on that definition, should be expected that relapse will take place. Okay? Addiction often involves cycles of relapse and remission. And without treatment, addiction is progressive and can result in disability or premature death. And we'll talk a little bit more about what that looks like. So let me talk a little bit about addiction and how basically it's a brain disease. It hijacks your brain. The drug hijacks your brain. So dopamine neurons are a common pathway for drug reinforcement within the brain. And during the initial stages of drug use, the substance or the drug positively reinforces that dopamine system and that reward system. So you're positively getting this reinforcement that makes you want to take more of the drug. But as your drug use escalates, the dopamine reward system becomes increasingly sensitive, but then it also adapts. So your brain adapts to it, and that's why you need more to get the same impact, okay? But if use continues and becomes chronic, There are neurochemical changes that take place in your brain. Now, these changes are reversible, but it takes a while for them to reverse. You have to be in recovery for a long time. But what happens is basically that the chemical changes that take place in your brain make you have the inability to control yourself and an inability to stop. There is actually receptors and pathways in your brain that are there to help you to be able to be disciplined and to stop doing certain things if you want to stop doing them. And your addiction hijacks all of those things, and your brain does not work properly anymore. So basically, the dopamine neurons stop functioning, and the dopamine deficiency causes people to feel anxious and depressed, and the person only feels normal when they're taking the drug, okay? And what you can notice is that many more people that try drugs actually become addicted to them, and there are individual differences that account for an increased vulnerability to drug abuse. So there's differences in the way that the drug reinforces the brain and how impulsive you are just by nature and your personality. Now, the differences to which a drug reinforces in your brain, those differences are really a part of your genetic makeup. So your family history and your genetic makeup really play a role in how your brain responds to drugs. So addiction involves multiple factors. Okay, so you've got your genetics and your biology. So your genetic makeup. There are some people who can take Benadryl and the Benadryl will put them to sleep, and other people will take Benadryl and the Benadryl will keep them awake. Okay, so we all respond differently to drugs just by nature because we're all different. Okay, so our genetics and biology, the way our biological system is set up, will play into whether or not you develop addiction. Also, the environment that you live in. Some people grow up in an environment where there's a lot of drinking or drug use in the house on the regular, and there are other people who grew up in households where that doesn't really happen, or maybe there's occasional drinking or drug use, maybe only during the holidays and so forth. So those kinds of pieces, they're the peer group, people that they spend time with, those all play into accessibility, culture, and things like that as to whether or not it's acceptable, whether or not you're exposed to it, you're around it. And then once you introduce the drug, then you've got the brain wiring that gets modified. And your brain wiring is influenced by your genetics and biology. It's influenced by the drug that you're taking, and it's also influenced by your outside environment. And all those things kind of play a part. So the risk factors for developing addiction are genetic. So family history is a big one. If you have a family history of addiction, it may be that you are more susceptible to developing addiction, just like somebody who might be more susceptible to developing cancer or diabetes because it's in the family. Okay. Then also mental health problems. As I mentioned to you before, people want to escape. So if you have a lot of mental health problems, taking a drug and feeling numb for a little while and feeling some relief from your pain, physical or emotional pain, can help, and so that can kind of take people down that road. Also, the environment. Are your peers misusing substances? Are the drugs around you? As I mentioned, many years ago, like 10, 15 years ago, prescription opiates in particular were much more available because doctors prescribed them much more often. And so people had accessibility. They were able to access the drugs, okay? Poverty can play a role, and also post-traumatic stress disorder, which is a mental health problem. Those are all things that can influence, or be a risk factor for addiction. So as I mentioned, genetics. So genetics can play a role in how we're susceptible to addiction and to the effects of drugs. So the genetics affect the way our body responds to the drug. So two people you could have a biological predisposition to drug sensitivity. So what does that mean? There are certain people, let's say, who have their body has a difficult time metabolizing nicotine or metabolizing alcohol. So if they do drink, the alcohol doesn't absorb quickly and they tend to get very sick. That's a protective factor that's made by the person's body, because the person's going to say, well, it makes me really sick, so I feel like crap when I drink, or I feel like crap when I smoke. So that's a deterrent, and they don't bother. Okay. But the biological predispositions can also play into, let's say, people that are in recovery. For example, like you might have two people in front of you that are in recovery. They both, want to stop. They both want to stay in recovery. They don't want to use drugs anymore. But one person, one person might have a biological predisposition that'll make it more difficult for them to stop, or more difficult for them to stay off the drugs, just because of the way that they're made up in their biology. For example, having increased withdrawal symptoms, some people again have different responses. So if your withdrawal symptoms are a lot more severe than the person next to you, you may be more likely to relapse just because you can't stand how painful the withdrawal is. So even though genes play a role, we still have the environment that's important. Okay, so you got half biology and genetics, and then you've got half of your environment. So parents have less influence than peers and same-sex siblings. You may not become addicted despite a predisposition if people around you don't use. So maybe you have a family history of alcohol abuse, but your mom or your dad married somebody who didn't use alcohol and was very serious about not having it in the home, and it wasn't around, and so you didn't really have a lot of exposure to it, so you just didn't end up going down that road. Some other environmental factors: you're less likely to develop addiction if you start using drugs late in life, if you're married, if you're religious, if you come from a strict household, if you have like a cohesive household where you have two caregivers, like two parents, things like that. And being part of a non-deviant peer group. If the peer group that you hang out with, and is involved in a lot of clubs and doesn't, go out at night drinking on the weekends or using drugs on the weekends, then you're, again, less likely to just be exposed to it. So now we're going to watch another little video about addiction. Nora Vakla was the head of the National Institute of Health, the National Institute on Drug Abuse, and she's really great at describing some of the ins and outs of addiction and how it hijacks the brain. So I want to share that with you now.
Can you imagine a pleasure so intense that you would be willing to give up everything you care for, your family, your friends, your health, your freedom, just to temporarily experience it? I certainly could not. Yet this was the way that the behavior of addicts was explained to me when I was a medical student, and the way it's still explained by many in the healthcare system. A perspective that has helped promote the notion of addiction as moral failure. But it's more incomprehensible than that, because my addicted patients could not understand it either. They said that the drug was no longer even pleasurable, and yet they could not stop taking it. And this loss of control over one's own behavior intrigued me so much that I've been trying to understand how this would happen. But where do you start? By then, we already knew from animal experiments that all of the drugs that produce addiction increase dopamine in the brain reward regions, activating them. However, what happens in the transition from being able to occasionally enjoy a drug into the compulsive administration of addiction was a complete mystery. I was very lucky that as I was finishing medical school, a new technology had emerged, positron emission tomography, that enabled us for the first time to image the living human brain. To me, as a young scientist, this was like science fiction, because it provided me with a tool that I could use to compare the function and biochemistry of the brain of a person that was addicted to drugs from that of someone who was not. And this image here illustrates our first findings, initially reported in cocaine abusers, that we went then to replicate in methamphetamine abusers, alcoholics, heroin abusers. And what we found was that the brain of addicted individuals had a reduction in the levels of dopamine D2 receptors. Dopamine D2 receptors regulate the function of the frontal areas of our brain that allow us to exert self-control, thus providing an explanation about why an addicted person would be more vulnerable to impulsive and compulsive drug administration. These findings made me start to wonder whether something similar could be happening in obesity. Because after all, most obese individuals want to lose weight, but they cannot control their food intake. So the same question, can you imagine food being so pleasurable that you are willing to forego 10 years of your life because of the adverse health consequences from obesity, or undergo the stigma from the disapproval cast by others because you cannot hide obesity? I certainly cannot think of such a food. Thus, we apply the same methodology to investigate morbidly obese individuals. And what we found was that just as for addiction, their brains had a reduction in the levels of dopamine D2 receptors, indicating to us that this was a biochemical signature of a brain where the capacity to control strong urges has been compromised. But why? Why? Why would this happen? Our brains are hardwired to respond to rewards, which then motivates our actions. Reward is a brilliant solution to ensure that we will do behaviors that are indispensable for the survival of the individual and of the species. Because after all, if food or sex were not rewarding, we would not eat or procreate. And dopamine is the chemical that signals reward in our brains. Interestingly, dopamine is increased not just by rewarding pleasurable stimuli, but also by stimuli that predict a reward, which we call conditioned stimuli. And again, this is a brilliant solution, because when you increase dopamine in your brain, that enhances the motivation and sustains the drive for you to do the behaviors that are necessary to procure the reward, therefore ensuring that you will go and get the food so you can eat it. For example, this great-looking chocolate, the visual of this great-looking chocolate is making me want to eat it now. And if I had it now, I would eat it. My brain is conditioned to chocolate, so that mere visual is making my brain predict that it's going to get a reward. And dopamine is going up in my brain just by visually observing that stimuli, which then makes me want to eat it. Most of the time, I'm actually able to resist that urge of wanting to eat that chocolate. Sometimes I fail and I feel very guilty later. And I find myself that I'm much more vulnerable to failing and to not be able to resist the temptation when I'm hungry. And the hungrier I am, the worse it gets. But this makes sense. When my brain is hungry, and particularly if I am starving, my brain gets into a state that I like to call of deprivation. In the state of deprivation, the main priority of my brain is to find the food so I can eat it. Because for most of human evolution, food was scarce and hard to come by. So you want to ensure that you would pay attention so that you would do the behaviors so that you could eat, because otherwise you may not survive. However, in our current environments where food is everywhere, this has become a liability. And in fact, I find myself constantly, actively having to suppress the urge to eat all of this extraordinary looking food that is everywhere. Food stimuli are everywhere. Visuals, auditory, smell. And when I eat the food, when I cannot resist it, I eventually feel satiated. And when I'm satiated, the food stops being rewarding to my brain, which then, of course, enables me to change my behaviors and to do things that in the past may have had an advantage over my survival later. However, our modern societies have engineered highly rewarding food that can bypass that satiety mechanisms. These are foods that are rich in sugar, fat, and salt. And these are foods that can trigger compulsive overeating in almost every one of us. These foods are the ones that can create havoc in the brain dopamine reward system. Highly rewarding food, just like drugs, produce sharp and short-lasting increases in dopamine, and the repeated and frequent administration progressively leads to a loss of dopamine D2 receptors, which then compromises our ability to control the strong urges to eat this very appealing food. Obesity, just like addiction, represent extreme consequences of the disruption of the systems in our brain that enable us to balance between immediate rewards that enable us to take care of immediate needs and behaviors that may have an advantage later once those immediate needs have been accomplished. Addiction and obesity have been stigmatized and dismissed as disorders of poor self-control, self-inflicted, personal behavioral choices. Personal behavioral choices. You know, I've never, ever met an addicted person who wanted to be an addict, nor have I ever met an obese person who wanted to be obese. Their dismissal are just problems of self-control. Can you imagine what it must be to want to stop doing something and not be able to do it? And you try, and you fail, and you try again, and you fail again, and again, and you start hating yourself for not being able to do it. I don't need to imagine. I can remember. My grandfather took his own life at his inability to control his alcoholism. One final and last relapse, and he surrendered to self-hatred. Or my obese adolescent patient who contemplated suicide to escape the relentless and cruel bullying from her peers. Dismissal of addiction and obesity as just problems of self-control ignores the fact that for us to be able to exert self-control, we require the proper function of the areas in our brains that regulate our behaviors. In simple terms, and taken to the extreme, it's like driving a car without brakes. No matter how much you want to stop, you will not be able to do it. Some of us, because of our genetics, our developmental trajectories, our social circumstances, are more vulnerable to these disorders than others. And though we don't know yet how to remediate the genetic and developmental vulnerability factors, we already have the tools to address the problem of obesity and of addiction. Because for the most part, obesity and addiction can be prevented. The current problems that we're facing of obesity are not the result of mutations in our genes, but of the dramatic changes in our environment that have occurred over the past decades. We, humans, excel at our ability to change environments. So why can we not re-engineer them so that instead of making us vulnerable, they strengthen our biology? We know how to prevent obesity. We've done it in the past in small communities. The challenge is not knowing how to do it. The challenge is in committing the resources now to create an infrastructure that provides with options and alternatives. But real options and real alternatives. Why can we not have food that is healthy, appealing, accessible, and affordable? Why can we not generate environments that promote rather than hinder physical activities? The challenge is in committing the resources now to build an infrastructure that will provide with real alternative and real choices for everyone, not just those that can afford it. Some will argue that creating such an infrastructure will be costly now. One can counter-argue that this will be more than offset by all of the savings from averted medical costs, plus the economical growth of a new food industry. So can we all imagine committing now for something that will provide us a much greater social benefit later? I certainly can. It makes sense. Not only will we save lots of money from averted medical consequences, but we will improve the health of all of us and that of the future generations. Thanks.
So, Nora Bachlau, very interesting information from her about the nature of addiction, how it all works.
You support.
Okay. And why it is indeed a disease of the brain. So now I want to talk a little bit about DSM diagnosis. So the DSM-5 basically changed the way addiction was diagnosed, or it's actually, there's no such thing as a diagnosis of addiction. It's actually substance use disorder, okay? So the way the DSM does it is that there's different classes of drug abuse, different classes of substance-related disorders, and it's based on the drug, okay? So every single substance use disorder in the DSM-5 has the same basic criteria, okay? Number 1, cognitive, behavioral, and physiological symptoms that impact your daily functioning. Number 2, continued use despite having problems. Impaired control, social impairment, risky use, tolerance, and withdrawal. And they all have this continuum from mild to severe. So you've got the same number of symptoms always, okay, which is, I think you've got 11 or 12 possible symptoms. So if you have 2 to 3, it's mild. If you have 4 to 5, it's moderate. And if you have 6 or more, it's considered a severe substance use disorder. So basically you have alcohol use disorder. So it's just by the drug, okay? So let me give you an example here. Okay, so here you go, alcohol-related disorders. So you've got your 11 criteria, okay? Taking the drug in larger amounts or a longer period than was intended, persistent or unsuccessful attempt to stop or control, a great deal of time spent obtaining, using, or recovering from it, craving it, having recurrent use that results in a failure to meet your obligations, continued use despite persistent, recurrent, or social or interpersonal problems, important social, occupational, recreational activities that are given up because of drug use, recurrent use in situations that are physically hazardous, like, for example, DUI, like operating machinery, things like that. Continuing to use despite knowledge of having a persistent or recurring physical or psychological problem that's exacerbated by the use. And then you've got tolerance, which is needing more to get the same effect. And then withdrawal, which is, basically your body's sick because you're missing the drug. So this is alcohol use disorder, okay? And so you've got mild, which is 2 to 3 symptoms, 4 to 5 symptoms, moderate, 6 or more severe. So just to give you an example, you have the exact same 11 criteria for cannabis-related disorders, okay? And exact same 11 criteria for opioid use disorders, okay? So just to give you a sense of how they've taken substance use disorders, put them on a continuum from mild to moderate to severe based on the number of symptoms, but it's actually by specific substance treatment. So how do we help people? What do we do? So can addiction treatment be successful? It is treatable, okay? Now you can see here, this is some of the research that's been done by National Institute on Drug Abuse. That they have funded a lot of research. And here you can see healthy brain, and then you have the brain of someone who's been misusing methamphetamine. You've got their brain at 1 month abstinence versus 14 months. So this shows that with prolonged abstinence, the brain can recover, and so we can get the transmitters and pathways in our brain to work properly again, okay? So these images that you're seeing here are the dopamine transporters in the brain. So it can recover, okay? Can addiction be cured? So addiction cannot be cured, but it can be managed, and that's really what the take-home message is. Treatment enables people to counteract the disruptive effects and regain control, okay? So does relapse mean treatment has failed? The answer to that is no. So in understanding that addiction is a chronic disease, any chronic disease has the potential for relapse, okay? So a relapse can be part of a process. Relapse rates for drug use are similar for other chronic medical conditions. If you stop following your medical treatment program, you're going to relapse. So if you look here on the right, you've got substance use disorders have a 40 to 60% relapse rate. Hypertension, so let's say eating properly, a low salt diet to keep your blood pressure down, 50 to 70% relapse rate. Asthma, 50 to 70%. There's also a similar number for diabetes, keeping to a strict diet and so forth. So treatment of chronic illnesses involves changing your behaviors. And relapse doesn't mean that your treatment has failed. It basically means that you need to go back to the doctor, resume your treatment, modify your treatment, try something else. So relapse is a normal part of recovery. Excuse me. So effective treatments. So, for example, if you're treating opioid addiction, the research indicates that medication is the best line of treatment. So that means taking buprenorphine, which is a medication that can help people when they are in recovery. So, in addition to medical treatments, you also have behavioral therapy, which is, of course, what we specialize in. So it's individually tailored treatment, okay? Most treatment approaches are abstinence-based, which means users are not supposed to be using any drugs. So even if alcohol was your drug of choice, it doesn't mean you can continue to smoke marijuana instead. Most treatments, are abstinent-based, which means you don't use any alcohol or drugs when you're in recovery. And I think it's also important to kind of understand that, it's a process and you have to expect the relapse in the process. And that's part of it. But it's important to tailor treatments the same way we would for any other client. So I think it's important to kind of be mindful of that and try to be mindful of your own assumptions about addiction, okay? In order to help people. I mean, a lot of people go to self-help. Alcoholics Anonymous, Narcotics Anonymous, those are 12-step groups. They are self-help groups, so they are not led by mental health professionals, okay? It's important to note. And a lot of people do use 12-step programs, and a lot of their recovery programs and treatment programs are based on the 12-step model, which includes abstinence, number one, but then includes the first step, which is admitting that you're powerless over alcohol or drugs and that your life has become unmanageable. That's the first step of Alcoholics Anonymous. And then you kind of go through the 12 steps and work those steps as part of your program. And AA is very effective, or has been effective for a lot of people, because you can find a meeting 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. You can find a meeting on a cruise ship. You can find a meeting in an airport. It's really everywhere. And so, you might have a counselor that is only available to you the hours of 9 and 5 or whatever, 9 to 8 at night. But, your sponsor, or there's a meeting, somebody available at 3 in the morning. There's people available during the holidays. And also, Alcoholics Anonymous provides a blueprint. Just work these 12 steps and you'll be able to stay on track. But most recovery programs are based on the 12 steps. Most recovery programs focus on helping people to reconnect themselves with others, reconnect to themselves, reconnect to other people in their lives that they've lost relationships with, changing their peer groups, developing coping skills instead of the maladaptive coping skills like substance abuse, developing healthy coping skills, healthy boundaries, things like that. And those are all the kinds of things that therapists work with people in recovery on. But again, it's a long-term process and something that we need to be patient with folks that are struggling with addiction. Okay. So that's the end of my show. I wanted to thank all of you for listening, and I invite you to please email me if you have any questions. And I thank you for your attention.